Hello and welcome back to Business Ethics. Today, we've got a lot to get through. We're going to talk about moral theory and its relationship to business. The goal today is to get you guys exposed to a variety of moral theories, that is, general theories about the content of morality, that are often used in a business ethics context. This will help to inform us going forward for the rest of the semester, including doing a precursor to some stuff we're going to talk about next week when it comes to corporate social responsibility. For next week, I want you to read Chapter 3 in Joseph Desjardins' Introduction to Business Ethics. This will be on corporate social responsibility. All right, let's get into it. So first, we're going to talk about the AIG, the case of AIG in the 2008 financial crisis. Then we're going to use utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics to talk about different aspects of that case over the course of the rest of today's lecture. So we'll be using the case throughout today. All right. Throughout the 1980s, mortgage-backed securities became one of the most profitable arms of the American financial sector. Mortgages would be packaged together according to risk management scores, prime, subprime, high risk, etc., and traded between financial institutions. The idea behind the mortgage-backed security was that mortgages are a rock-solid investment opportunity because mortgage defaults are dire for individual consumers and so are rare. The catchphrase being, everyone pays their mortgage. If people don't pay their mortgages, they lose their homes. You get the logic. Unfortunately, as the mortgage-backed security market grew, pressure on companies managing individual home sales to create supplies for MBSs would begin to reach a fever pitch. As a result, realtors had strong incentives to sell homes, and mortgage lenders had strong incentives to approve even the most high-risk homeowners. Enter American International Group, AIG. The American International Group made immense profits off of this system. AIG was responsible for giving mortgage-backed securities good ratings through insuring them as low-risk, high-yield items. The idea was that AIG would take all of these mortgages, package them into clusters, and give them high rating by giving them premium insurance that made it look like they were rock-solid investments. As a result, with the proliferation of millions of high-risk investments, people began to default on mortgages en masse. As a result, the housing market crashed. AIG did not have the money to make payments on their insurance and so began to fail. So, millions of people potentially facing foreclosure, AIG completely out of money because they were so far into the mortgage-backed security game and had taken on so much risky insurance that they were completely unable to pay once the housing bubble popped. However, AIG persuaded federal lawmakers that they were integral enough to the American economy that they were too big to fail. That is to say, as a banking group, as a group associated with basically all of the major American banks, the AIG had become so central to the economy that they were able to convince the lawmakers that they were too big to fail, and as a result, they received massive bailouts. The federal government approved a $180 billion bailout plan for AIG alone, and a lot of bailout money for other companies as well, saving the too big to fail company. One of the groups most responsible for the housing crisis then was effectively saved by the government, with very little coming in the way of new regulations. So, very little happened to AIG afterwards. There was no new regulations. New regulatory bodies that did exist were phased out rather quickly. There weren't really many new standards. They changed the name of mortgage-backed securities, but they didn't really necessarily change the practice itself. As a result, many in the public were completely outraged. Millions of people faced foreclosure. Lots of people lost their jobs. As a result, we had widespread Occupy protests. I guess You all are a little too young to remember this, but the Occupy protests were protests of a set of sit-ins across the country that lasted weeks. Right? These people were wondering, why should the government lift a finger to help AIG? Why should it help the banks that caused this crisis in the first place, while ordinary people are left out to dry? In the midst of this outrage, in the midst of the public backlash to the government bailout, AIG announced that it had used part of its bailout to approve $1.2 billion in salary bonuses, including the most concentrated bit of $160 million for executives. Many in the public thought that these bonuses were a clear example of corporate greed. Regular people are left to suffer, while the rich get richer after causing that suffering in the first place. Indeed, many thought that they were merely a symptom of a larger trend of wealth disparity. In 1960, executives made 12 times the lowest employee. By 2012, this disparity had risen to 231 times to one employee. AIG's actions led to higher scrutiny on executive spending and salaries. Calls for executive salary caps gained popularity, but Congress refused to take action. AIG, for its part, provided a defense of these bonuses. They argued that, 1, the bonuses compensated executives for what they were owed for past contracts, and 2, the bonuses were necessary to maintain top talent in the company. Both sides of the debate about AIG made ethical appeals. AIG argued that they were too big to fail. The consequences would be disastrous for people, so they have to be saved. They argued that they were owed the bonuses, that they needed them to retain top talent in the industry, without which the economy would suffer. Critics, on the other hand, argued that AIG already had failed. They had played fast and loose and crashed the economy, making the lives of common people significantly worse at little cost to themselves. They argued that AIG was not owed anything. They had done something wrong and should be punished. The claims made by AIG and by their critics have something in common. They're all normative claims. That is to say, they're not merely descriptive claims. A descriptive claim is a claim about the way something is, simpliciter. My car broke down. It's going to be sunny tomorrow, etc. A normative claim is a claim which includes content about what should be the case. You owe me for what you stole from me. Racism is wrong, etc. The difference between a descriptive claim is that it merely aims to describe the world as it is, and a normative claim has some content which pertains to some standard about the way the world ought to be. You owe me for what you stole from me. You owe me is a normative claim. Racism is wrong. Racism is being ascribed a certain property, wrongness. Racism is wrong. Wrongness has to do with what ought to be the case, or what is good or bad. Ethics, the subject matter of this class, primarily concerns the nature and scope of normative claims. Today we're going to talk about normative theory. A normative theory is an account which provides a systematic and practical guide to the ethical life. A normative theory aims to 1. Account for common moral judgments, i.e., racism is bad, and 2. To offer guidance about how we ought to act going forward. Different normative theories do 1 and 2 in different ways. That is to say, they both give different accounts of common moral judgments, that is, different explanations for what makes something wrong, and they offer different kinds of guidance about what we ought to do going forward. Today we're going to consider 3 of these accounts: utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics. We will also discuss them as they relate to the specifics of the AIG case. Let's start with utilitarianism, one of the more popular moral theories. Utilitarianism is a moral theory that was developed in the 18th and 19th century by British philosophers, though it's predated by some people before these British philosophers, who we might call proto-utilitarians. It really gained popularity with a group of philosophers, with a pair of philosophers known as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Utilitarianism holds that an act is right if and only if it maximizes happiness and minimizes suffering for all parties. Side note, whenever you see me write IFF, an if with two Fs, that's shorthand for if and only if. Philosophers use this language a lot, so you should make sure that you're getting used to it. Utilitarians are motivated by the idea that ethics is all about maximizing the good. Thus, they care the most about making things go best for everyone. For utilitarians, the morality of an action is just about maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering for everyone relevant. The basic components of utilitarianism are as follows. Utilitarianism is typically committed to at least these three theses. First, consequentialism. The only measure of an act is its consequences. Morality is determined fundamentally by consequences. That is to say, when we're trying to determine whether an act is right or wrong, all that matters for our evaluation at bottom is the consequences of that act, or the predictable or possible consequences of that act as well. A theory of well-being. Utilitarians must provide a theory of well-being, some theory of what makes a life go better, which we might call happiness, and what makes it go worse, which we might call suffering. Frequently, utilitarians have been hedonists, which means that they have defined happiness in terms of pleasure or a good feeling, and suffering in terms of pain or bad feelings. And finally, impartiality. Since all that matters is consequences, and what matters in those consequences is well-being, that is, the extent to which your life goes better or worse, then everybody's well-being matters equally. So, utilitarians are committed to the impartiality of morality. You don't get to give yourself extra weight because it's you who's making the decision. You don't get to give your family extra weight because you love your family. You don't get to give people of a certain race extra weight or gender extra weight when you're making your moral decisions. It's just not permitted. For utilitarians, then, morality is a matter of making the right calculations in terms of how people are impacted by our actions. They literally think we should go out and look and see how people's lives are affected. We use proxies for our well-being. We can see how people are affected economically. We can see how people are affected with regards to their health over time. And we can see how people are affected with regard to their self-reports about how well their life is going. Let's talk about the relationship between business and utilitarianism. Utilitarianism has long been popular for those who've theorized about economics and business. Adam Smith, for example, the father of capitalist theory, is a precursor to the utilitarians. He was what we called a proto-utilitarian. And many of the utilitarians owe a great deal to Adam Smith's theory. Neoclassical economists, therefore, argued using utilitarian theory that free markets were morally justified because they meet consumer demands, thus satisfying consumers' wants and needs, making them happy. On this view, the justification for free markets or market economies in general is that markets are a way to efficiently and universally satisfy people's desires and make people happy over time. That is not to say everyone is happy after market interactions. It's only to say that as a tool within society and institution, we can expect that when people play in the market, they will come out the better for it. And those who aren't made directly better by it will be made better by the exchange of others. Thus, utilitarians, with regard to business, prize efficiency, usefulness, and innovation. Famously, utilitarians hold a festival once a year where different utilitarians put forward a set of tools and they argue about which one is the most efficient, which one has the most uses, which one has the most lasting uses, so on and so forth. As with all the moral theories we're talking about today, we're only getting a small glimpse at utilitarianism. In a larger, full-length class, we would do more of a deep dive on utilitarianism. But since this class is condensed, I want to keep us focused on the relationship between utilitarianism and business in particular. While there may be things that you're not sure about, such as how do utilitarians propose that we calculate happiness of an action over time, although I've suggested some reasons for thinking that that's doable previously, and questions about what utilitarians take to be the important features in measuring the consequences of an action. Right now, all we have to think about, or all we're able to think about, is the net happiness and suffering that is created by an action. For our purposes, that'll be sufficient, and if we need more, we can talk about that at a later date. So let's talk about AIG as it relates to utilitarianism. So how would utilitarian theory evaluate the actions of AIG? Consider, for example, the case of the executive bonuses. AIG offered the following justifications for their executive bonuses after the bailout. 1. Executives are owed these bonuses for past contracts. And 2. We need larger bonuses to retain top talent. That is, we have to be able to keep those executives who are already here. We can visit 2 at some point, but for now, we'll focus on 1. Executives are owed these bonuses for past contracts. Do these arguments stand up to scrutiny? Well, the first claim by AIG is this. Quote, executives are owed the bonuses. To say that someone is owed something in the moral sense is to say that they deserve it. Since utilitarians only care about maximizing happiness, how should we determine whether or not someone deserves something? Well, one answer is this. Someone deserves something if and only if their actions caused a good outcome. Can you think of any problems with this? The idea is this. If someone does something that causes something good to happen, then they made an action which a utilitarian would recommend. As such, does that mean they're owed something? Or can we think of problems that would show up that would make us reticent to say that someone would be owed something, even if they did something that caused something good to happen? Man, I'm really annoyed that the auto adjustment made all the IMs on utilitarianism delayed. This is really bothering me, but I can't bring myself to go fix it, so we're just going to deal with it. So imagine the following case. Bob the mad scientist. A mad scientist named Bob creates an extremely viral strain of the flu. His intention is to turn everyone into obedient and mindless zombies. If he succeeds, the whole world will do his bidding. However, unbeknownst to Bob, the virus cures all current and future cancer instead. That is, instead of creating a zombie army that's loyal to him, it just cures cancer. Bob's actions lead to incredibly good consequences. Perhaps the elimination of cancer once and for all. Does that mean that we owe Bob our praise? After all, his actions certainly seem to maximize happiness and minimize suffering. What should the utilitarians say? No way. That's how most of us think about Bob the mad scientist, right? Most of us see Bob and we say, there's no way he deserves our praise. So utilitarians agree with this. They think of deservingness, praise, and blame, all of these notions, as justified on the basis of its consequences, just like anything else. So, praise and blame are tools for social reinforcement. We praise people for doing good, so that they'll continue to do good, and so that others will do good in the future just like them. So determining whether we owe AIG executives a bonus is a matter of determining whether and how we want to incentivize or disincentivize their actions. Many in the public argue that we have no reason to incentivize their behaviors, the behaviors of AIG, because the AIG's behaviors led to countless harms. Likewise, we have no reason to think they should be seeking to retain quote-unquote top talent when that top talent is responsible for this mess. So, on the utilitarian view of desert, what matters for praise and blame, for justifying what we are owed and what someone is owed, is not whether they in fact did well or did good, but whether praising them for doing good or blaming them for doing bad will cause future good things or future bad things to occur. In this way, when we look at Bob, we can think, all right, so Bob did something that utilitarians will say is good. Does that mean that we should praise Bob or reward Bob? Not necessarily, because rewarding Bob's behavior will make more people act like Bob. And if more people act like Bob, then more people will try to take over the world and make everyone into mindless zombies. And that's not a good thing. So we don't want that consequence to be realized. So maybe we would instead blame Bob, maybe even punish Bob for attempting to do what he did, even though it led to something great. But there's a problem for how we think about utilitarianism. The sheriff. The sheriff of a small town faces a dilemma. A member of one of the most prominent families in town has been murdered. This family, the Joneses, has a bitter and brutal rivalry with another family in town, the Johnsons. Almost every citizen in the county has a strong allegiance to the Jones or to the Johnsons. To the Johnsons, sorry. For years, there's been an uneasy peace, but now everyone thinks that Johnson killed the young Jones boy. Violence is imminent in the streets. The sheriff knows that people will die in an all-out feud if he does not find a non-Johnson murderer, that is, someone who killed the Jones boy who's not a Johnson. The sheriff notices a drifter at the train station, who he knows could not have been there during the time of the murder. Nevertheless, the sheriff knows he could pin the murder on the drifter and assuage the threat of violence in the town. Should the sheriff pin the crime on this innocent man? Most people, when they are faced with this case, think, no. The sheriff shouldn't pin the crime on an innocent because it's morally wrong to convict someone of a crime that they did not commit. Now, utilitarians will say that people have this judgment because we believe the sheriff will get caught eventually, meaning the violence will occur anyway, or new violence will occur. Or that the guilty party will be free to murder again, potentially solving nothing at all. But critics can deny this. Even if we insist that this won't happen, we typically don't feel right convicting an innocent man. That is to say, allow us to insist. It's our story, after all. Allow us to insist that the sheriff will never get caught, and no one will ever find out, and the person who killed the Jones boy will never kill again. Assume that. Does that make it okay? Most of us will feel like, no, not quite. But if that's right, then it seems like something other than the consequences of the sheriff's actions are playing a role here. That is, it seems like there's something wrong about violating the rights of the innocent drifter, even if it's not the consequences that makes it wrong. Why is that? Critics say because consequences aren't all that matters. Now let's look at another ethical view, a view which will try to take that thought very seriously, a view we call deontology. Deontology is also thought of as duty ethics. In our textbook, the author calls it principle-based ethics. Deontology is a branch of ethics which is fundamentally non-consequentialist, meaning that any talk of consequences that they have are ultimately not going to be regarded as fundamental to the moral theory. Just like whenever a utilitarian talks about rights or freedom, they can do so, but fundamentally it all has to be about consequences at the bottom. Rather than consequences, deontologists think that morality is all about doing your duty, respect following moral rules, and protecting people's rights, even if the consequences in doing so are hard to stomach. Recall that the utilitarian thinks that morality is all about doing what makes things go best for everyone. On the other hand, the deontologist says it's not about making things go best for everyone. It's about doing your duty. It's about respecting people's rights. It's about protecting people. The most famous deontologist, Immanuel Kant, put this forward in his famous categorical imperative. He said, "Act only such that you treat humanity, whether in yourself or that of another, always as an end and never as a mere means to an end." What does that mean? Well, to treat someone as a mere means to an end is to treat them as if they're just a tool for achieving your goals. But as Kant points out, people are not tools. They're tool users. That is to say, they have their own ends, and they should be treated as a source of value, rather than an instrument for achieving value, or rather than a mere instrument for achieving value, where mere means only an instrument. For this reason, Kantian ethicists usually put hard lines against things like owning slaves, cheating, lying, or breaking promises. These are often the subject matters that they care about most, morally speaking. So let's think about the relationship between business and deontology, or Kantianism. Deontological ethics have also had a huge influence on theorizing about ethics in business. According to liberal and neoliberal theorists in economics, markets are justified as a tool for trading resources. In a market of free exchange, we can treat each other with dignity and respect each other's rights to our property. The idea is this: in a free market system, or at least some kind of market-based system, we have the ability for a free exchange between individuals within that market. When I come to the market with my cantaloupes, which I own because I cultivated them, I can trade them with you. You can buy my cantaloupes for the price that I set. I can set my price according to your demand, and so on. This exchange allows me to preserve my right to my cantaloupes, my property, and you to preserve and acquire things which help you to meet your needs and to respect your own rights to utilize your money as you please. So, on the deontological view of markets, this is one of the on the liberal and neoliberal views of markets, this is one of the ways we justify morally the existence of markets. We're going to talk about both the neoclassical and liberal theories of economics again next week when we talk about corporate social responsibility. And when we do, we'll do so in a little bit more detail. Thus, deontological ethics prize keeping promises, preserving freedom, and preventing cheating or taking advantage of the market system. So let's talk about AIG then. Recall that the arguments made by AIG that they needed to pay out large executive bonuses to make good on promises from before the crisis. Utilitarians would reply that this argument only works if we should believe that making good on these promises will have the best consequences, all things considered. But for a Kantian or a deontologist, we're morally required to keep our promises, maintain our vows, and execute our valid contracts. So, does that mean that AIG is off the hook for a Kantian? Well, first notice this. We're only talking about the narrow claim that AIG made, that their executives were owed their contracted payments. This does not mean that AIG should have been bailed out. It might be that the Kantian thinks that AIG originally should not have been bailed out because they cheated in the market. They did something morally wrong. They treated the public as a mere means to an end. So when we have this discussion about whether or not AIG's payment of executive bonuses was morally wrong, remember that we're focusing on that narrow issue, not the broad issue about whether or not AIG's bailout was legitimate. So according to deontologists, the executive bonuses must be paid out so long as they are required by a contract that is in good standing. But when is a contract, quote, in good standing? One answer is this: when both parties have consented in the morally relevant sense. That is, the morally relevant sense of consent. But what is the morally relevant sense of consent? Let's consider some cases where contracts do not seem to be in good standing to get a better idea of this. Consider the following case. Jean is contracted or is contractually obligated to pay Joe for a new back patio that she does not remember ordering. She signed the contract after a night of drinking with Joe, and she returned from vacation with a new back patio and a large invoice for a payment to Joe. Is Jean's contract morally legitimate? Most people think no. Jean was not in the right mental state to agree to Joe's services. So, a contract in good standing, a contract that is consensual, requires that consent be given in the right frame of mind. Here's another case. Kevin is contractually obligated to help Don build a factory, but Kevin only agreed to this because Don held a gun to his head. Is Kevin morally obligated to build this factory? Again, most people think no. Kevin's choice was made under clear coercion, which makes it illegitimate. So, morally relevant consent requires a lack of coercion as well. Finally, consider a case where Mark has been tasked with building a school on what he now knows to be a dangerous chemical waste dump. When Mark signed the deal, he knew nothing about the chemical waste. This was kept from him until after he signed the contract, which is not what happened in the Love Canal case, if you remember from last week. Is Mark morally obligated to build the school? Most people think no. In fact, Mark may be morally required not to build the school. So, morally relevant consent must be adequately informed about all of the stakes at hand, all of the things that might be relevant for making the decision about whether or not an individual would sign the contract. So, to summarize, we have a set of contractual standards. First, a contract in good standing must be signed under the right frame of mind. Contracts must be made under conditions which are conducive to understanding, acting rationally, and being of sound mind. Second, coercion. Contracts must not be coerced. Contracts cannot be made under threats of violence, loss, domination, or harm to others. So you can't even coerce me by saying you're going to shoot my mom, believe it or not. And finally, contractual standards require informed consent. Contracts must be made under conditions where all relevant information has been made available. So whether AIG's bonuses were morally required will minimally depend on whether the existing executive contracts were met the above conditions. Do we have reason to think that they did? Well, that depends on who exactly is party to the contract. AIG might argue that the contract, understood as a contract between corporation and employee, was in good standing. That is, the contract which required them to pay executive bonuses. All employees who signed such contracts, all executives who signed such contracts, were of sober mind, were uncoerced, and were fully informed. Critics, however, might argue that the source of money changes things. Since the money that's used to pay these executive bonuses was bailout money provided by taxpayers, the state and citizens can put conditions on how the money is used. This is standard for contracts that are revised after being signed. And in fact, that seems to be what has happened. The company failed and was bailed out by the government. The state and taxpayers have an interest in how that money is going to be used to bail out the company. If they went back and did the exact same thing again, that would be a problem, something that the state could intervene in. So some people think this gives us some reason to think that the terms of the contract have changed and conditions can be put onto the contract. The citizens did not know the money would be used in this way. Furthermore, they did not know that AIG was engaging in under-the-table deals at the time of the original contracts. So maybe the terms of informed consent were violated. Furthermore, we might think that the contract is being enforced even though it was made under circumstances that were uncoerced. It's being enforced under coercive circumstances. AIG came to the state government, federal government, and said, "We're unable to fail. If we fail, we tank your economy." This sounds like a threat. Like I came up to you holding a grenade and said, "I need you to read this chapter. If you don't, I'm going to let go of this grenade, and that would suck for both of us. So, critics might argue that AIG's original contracts were not in good standing. I'm not sure what to think about this. That's up to you. In fact, it might be relevant for you, for your thinking, to include in today's discussion post, in this week's discussion post. We'll see. Finally, in both of the previous analyses, ethical theories have focused on the moral status of actions for corporations like AIG. We've asked, were these bonuses legitimate actions? Did they violate informed consent? Were they part of valid contracts? Did they maximize the right kinds of consequences? But we might also think that this misses a major moral critique of AIG's executive bonuses. We don't just care about whether the executive bonuses were what was going to make things go best, and we don't just care about whether or not the contracts that those were based on were good contracts. Rather, many people criticize these actions as an instance of pernicious moral greed, a widespread problem in the corporate world. Unlike utilitarianism and deontology, virtue ethics contends that the fundamental moral questions are not about the status of actions, but about the status of character and the character traits that define human actions. Rather than asking the question, was my action right or wrong, virtue ethicists ask the question, am I a good person? According to virtue ethicists, virtues are morally good character traits and vices are morally bad character traits. You are a morally good person to the extent that you manifest various virtues, and you're a morally bad person to the extent that you manifest various vices. On one of the most influential accounts of virtue ethics comes from Aristotle. Aristotle theorized that virtues are a way of balancing one's practical character, one's predisposition to act in various ways. We want a character which is devoid of various excesses. I don't want to be excessively greedy. I don't want to be excessively cowardly, so on and so forth. I would rather... What a good person is a person who's balanced along these dimensions. We should, according to Aristotle, seek to realize what he called the golden mean, a point of balance between excess and deficiency. For example, bravery is a virtue, but it's found between two vices, the vice of cowardice and the vice of foolhardiness. If you take unnecessary risks, if you rush into the building to try and save the child, the burning building, to try and save the child, when there are trained firefighters there next to you who can do that job instead, you're acting foolhardy. That's vicious. You shouldn't take that risk. You're acting excessively risky. If you take no risks, if you're not willing to help anyone, if you're not willing to, help the firefighter do what they ask, like break the window for them with a hammer that's nearby, even if the risk to you is rather minor, then you're showing that you have a deficiency, an excess of deficiency in risk taking. So you are a coward, and that's also vicious. But there are many virtues and vices which we associate typically and archetypically with business. To name a few, we say of morally good business people that they are innovative, creative, even-tempered, and cool-headed, philanthropic, charitable, and more. We say of morally bad business people that they're greedy, underhanded, self-serving, and cheats. When you're thinking about, for example, where to take your car to get it fixed, you think about mechanics. It's very common for you to make a virtue ethical judgment. You think, do I trust this mechanic? Do I think this mechanic is trustworthy? That is, do they have the character trait of being worthy of my trust? Or are they underhanded? Are they going to try and upsell me? Are they going to try and cheat me out of my money? In that case, the mechanic has a moral vice, right? So you're familiar with these kinds of judgments, I think. Now, let's look at the vice of greed. Greed, in Aristotle, it's called pleonexia, is typically understood as an excess of taking more than one's fair share. The public criticized AIG for corporate greed, a phenomenon where corporate actors are regarded as taking far above their fair share. Many people point to the increasing wealth disparity, even within individual companies, as evidence of corporate greed run amok. But whether AIG's actions count as greedy will depend on whether we think executives have taken more than their fair share. Corporations often defend themselves, arguing that since they are responsible for such a large amount of the economic output in a society, executives' larger share of the wealth is in fact earned. Critics might contend that while some extra compensation may be warranted, things have gotten out of hand, as is consistently shown by the metrics of inequality. Yes, it may be the case that executives work hard and produce a lot of economic stimulus. But does that mean that they work so much harder than the bottom line workers that they deserve that much more pay? I'll leave that up for you to decide. For our purposes, what matters is when we're determining whether or not the companies are greedy, these are the kinds of considerations that we're trying to make. That's a virtue ethical kind of analysis we're trying to give. Okay. Finally, here's your discussion post for the week. Suppose you are the final vote on a three-way tie to create a new regulative rule for executive salaries going forward. You must vote for one of the three following policies. First, the no cap policy. There should be no cap on executive salaries. They should be permitted to go as high as the markets will allow them. 2, there should be an absolute cap. There should be a hard limit on executive salaries. Nobody needs that amount of excess. We should tax 100% of every dollar over $30 million. 3, there should be a relative cap. There should be no hard cap on executive salaries. Instead, executives should be required to maintain a proper ratio within non-executive workers. Executives are not to make more than 25 times the salary of their lowest paid employee. Which of these salary options would you vote for? Which of these salary caps would you vote for? Why? I'd like you to utilize at least one moral theory we discussed in class to justify your decision in your discussion. It's also fine if you need to edit some of the numbers a little bit. So we put an absolute cap on salaries. Maybe you want it to be more or less than $30 million. We put a relative cap. Maybe we want it to be more or less than 25 times the salary of the lowest paid employee. If you're doing that, explain why in your discussion post. Anyway, that's all for today. For next week, I want you to read Chapter 3, Joseph Desjardins' Introduction to Business Ethics, the chapter on corporate social responsibility. Thank you very much. Everyone have a good week. Make sure you do your discussion posts and your quiz. Discussion posts due Wednesday, then Friday. Quiz due Friday.